Have you ever noticed that some things just trigger memories? Maybe it's a place, maybe it's an image, maybe it's a smell, maybe it's a sound, but it takes you back to a moment in time or a person in your life. Recently, my wife was shopping at a thrift store, and she texted me a picture, and she says, "Hey, do you need this T-shirt?" And I said, "Absolutely." So this is the T-shirt she bought me. And the reason that I said absolutely, here, I'll come over here. Some of you are craning to see. The reason is because it reminded me of my dad. Growing up, we had a record player and a handful of albums. And my dad grew up in Plaid, Missouri, on a farm. They ran a sawmill with his dad and his brothers. And he grew up listening to Porter Wagner and Hank Sr. And he had those albums. And he added Waylon Jennings and Merle Haggard. And I can remember so many times on rainy days, my dad standing, staring out the window in his overalls, listening to those songs. And it just takes me back to a moment and back to my dad. And so I said, yes, I will wear that proudly. My mom, on the other hand, she grew up in Southern California in the 50s and 60s. And when her and my dad got married, she added to his album collection the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. And I remember growing up, her working around the house, flitting around doing housework, listening to those songs. And I know for me, like musically, the Beatles stuck more. But what I have found very interesting is that in so many of the mundane moments of life, it's the lyrics of the Rolling Stones that come back to me. My kids would attest to this, that it's happened very often, that they'll be griping or complaining or pouting about something, and I'll just say, "You can't always get what you want." And they're like, "Oh no, Dad." I'm like, "No, you can't always get what you want." They're like, "Don't do it." And I'm like, "Can't always get what you want, but you might find that you'll get what you need." They hate it, right? Because we all love our own setup, don't we? We love things to be the way we want them. And some of us are maybe more honest with ourselves about that than others, but how many of you found that life doesn't always go the way that you want? Yeah. And so what do you do when life doesn't go the way that you want it to go? Really, as I've thought about it, we really only have two options. You can either be content with it, or you can start to resent it. For you today, I don't know what's going on in your life, but maybe you're in a situation where at your job you just feel like you're not getting noticed. Maybe your benefits are getting cut. Maybe you're getting passed over for promotions, and you look around and you see other people stepping ahead of you, and you don't feel like it's fair, and you just kind of feel a little bit frustrated about it. Maybe others of you look around to your friends, and man, everyone else seems to be more successful, and every time you think you've made an improvement, they've done it twice as good as you have, and you're just a little frustrated about that. Or maybe you just simply look around and you see a lot of people who are taller, slimmer, more successful, and smarter than you, and you resent them a little bit. And when that starts to really start taking root, what we find out is those resentments lead really to this thing called jealousy, where I look to other people and I'm like, man, I wish I had what they had. And we might not say that out loud, but we so often feel that way. And here's the thing, what I found out about jealousy, is that jealousy, at its core, if you really trace it all the way back down, what jealousy says is that I think God owes me. Now, that may sound crazy to you, but think about it. You don't really want your neighbor's car or house. You don't really want your sister's wardrobe. You don't really want that other guy's job. You just want one like it. And if God is the one who's in charge of everything, in control of everything, can do everything, He's the one who should have given it to you. And so if you don't have it, He owes you. I've often wondered if Mick Jagger was actually reading the book of James when he wrote that song, "You Can't Always Get What You Want." Because in the 4th chapter of James's letter, he says this: "You desire and you don't have." And actually, James goes on to say that that's the source of our fighting and quarreling and grumbling and fit throwing. Anybody ever throw a fit because you didn't get your way? I have, right? And he says, so this is why you complain. This is why you're griping, is because you desire and you don't have what you want. It comes from unfulfilled desires. And so what do we do when we don't have our desires are unfulfilled? Well, we gripe about it to everyone who will listen. We blame people who we think have control to do something about it. And then we start spinning and manipulating situations to try to finally get satisfied. But just like Mick Jagger said, I can't find no satisfaction. No. Right? Do you notice that we have appetites in our life that we can't seem to fulfill? There's thirst that you can't quench. Who here likes food? I'm probably going to eat some later. Guess what? I'm going to eat some later. And after that, I'll eat some more. We never can get quite enough to fully fulfill us, can we? Same thing goes with money and success and recognition. Fun. We live in a culture that raises entertainment and fun to the utmost degree, and we can't get enough of it. And then we want people to notice us. We can't seem to get enough likes on Instagram. No amount of those things is enough to fully satisfy us. And why? Well, James tells us it's because you ask and you don't receive because you ask with wrong motives. Listen to this. So that you may spend it on your pleasures. James is saying that we're asking for the wrong things if we're not satisfied. And so we're gonna see an extreme example of this today. We're going to be in Numbers chapter 11. So if you want to open your Bibles, we'll be there in a minute. In Numbers chapter 11. We've been working through the book of Leviticus and sharing over that the last few weeks. If you've been reading along with our reading plan, you will have finished that weird book of Leviticus this week and jumped on into Numbers. But what we'll find is it's really a continuation of the same situation. If you read through the first 5 books of the Bible, you're going to read through the Genesis creation event and Abraham's story onto Joseph's story. But then in Exodus, you're going to hear Moses' story and how the Israelites were released from Egypt. And in Exodus chapter 19, they leave Egypt and they camp at Mount Sinai. And from Exodus 19 to Numbers chapter 10, so that covers all of the book of Leviticus, all the way into Numbers. That was this 1-year period where they're camped at Mount Sinai. And over that period of 1 year, God was telling them who he was and what he expected of them and gave them the law and told them how to worship him. And they built the tabernacle and everything that they needed to worship God in that. And then so finally, in Leviticus, like God starts saying, okay, you're about ready. We're about ready to go to that promised land I told you that we're going to. And so because I'm going to be in your presence and I'm a holy, set-apart God, Leviticus is a month worth of rules of how to act around a holy God. And so that's what you got in Leviticus. And then in Numbers, he begins them to get ready for travel. And so he has them take a census. They count all the heads, see who's with them so they don't lose anybody on the trip. We do that a lot in our car. Is everyone here when we leave? Is everyone still there when we get there? And then he says, and here's how I want you to organize. And so you're going to read this week if you're reading the reading plan, how he's going to organize them for travel. And then in Numbers 9, they finally get ready to start the trip. So check this out. This will be on the screen for you. It says, in the first month of the 2nd year, after their departure from the land of Egypt, the Lord told Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, the Israelites are to observe the Passover at its appointed time. You must observe it at its appointed time on the 14th day of this month at twilight. You're to observe it according to all its statutes and ordinances. See, the very first Passover meal and festival was a year prior. And they were still in Egypt. They're still in slavery. They're asking to be let go by Pharaoh so they could go worship God. And on that night, they ate the Passover meal. And in that moment, God passed over them and killed all the firstborn of everyone in Egypt. And the next day, Pharaoh let them go. And so it was this reminder, it was this moment of freedom for them. And so here they are 1 year later. Can you imagine this? The first anniversary of that. And now they are no longer under Egypt's rule and they're ready to enter that promised land. And you would think it would be this wonderful moment of joy. And you add to that God's presence was with them. Listen to this in verse 15. It says, on that day the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle and the tent of the testimony, and it appeared like fire above the tabernacle from evening until morning. It remained that way continuously. The cloud would cover it, appearing like fire at night. Whenever the cloud was lifted up above the tent, the Israelites would set out at the place where the cloud stopped. There the Israelites camped. At the Lord's command, the Israelites set out, and at the Lord's command, they camped. As long as the cloud stayed over the tabernacle, they camped. And so God's presence was with them, and he told them when to go, and he told them when to stay, and he led them through this process. It's a beautiful, powerful moment. And then in chapter 10, verse 11, it says, during the 2nd year, in the 2nd month, on the 20th day of the month, the cloud was lifted up above the tabernacle of the testimony. The Israelites traveled on from the wilderness of Sinai, moving from one place to the next until the cloud stopped in the wilderness of Paran. They set out for the first time according to the Lord's command through Moses. And so finally, they were ready to make this journey. And so the cloud lifted and they got ready to set out. In verse 33, it says this, they set out from the mountain of the Lord on a 3-day journey with the ark of the Lord's covenant traveling ahead of them for those 3 days to seek a resting place for them. And so I think we've got a map of this. It's going to give you a picture. But how long do they say this trip was supposed to take? I just want us to be clear on that. How long? 3 days. It's a 3-day trip. okay? And so they had been released from Egypt, which is on your left there, and they had traveled across the Red Sea, and they had come down here to Mount Sinai, down in the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula, and they had been camped there for a year. And now they're about to get ready to leave, and they're going to go north, and if you see up at the top right, you'll see Jerusalem, and that's where Israel is at. That's where they're headed to the Promised Land. And so they were going up to the wilderness of Paran, and they finally wind up at Kadesh Barnea, and that's the border of that Promised Land. 3 days. Who here likes a road trip? Okay, that's more. First service is about a third of us. So two-thirds were like, no, thanks. About half of you guys like road trips. I like road trips. I was on a road trip this week. I got to go to Nashville, Tennessee for a conference with 3 other pastors from Missouri. Had a great time, a great visit. But how long does it take normally on a road trip for someone to start complaining? I heard 5 minutes. I heard someone say 5 minutes. You get in there and someone doesn't have enough leg room, or it's too hot, or it's too cold, or someone's thirsty, or someone has to go to the bathroom, or he's touching me. And these were grown adults I was with, right? and it just does not take very long for that to happen. And so here we are. They're on this road trip. Again, you think, man, the fulfillment of all this, and God's presence was with them, and they'd seen miracles, and it was amazing. And what do? They complain about the journey, and complain about Moses' leadership, and they complain about the food. And so this is where we're at in Numbers chapter 11. They start this journey, verse 1, almost immediately. Now the people began complaining openly before the Lord about hardship. Doesn't tell us how soon, but definitely within 3 days. They were complaining about these things. And, Garrison Keillor is a humorist and was a host of the public radio program, A Prairie Home Companion. And I love how he talks about this. He says, "My people aren't paradise people. We've lived in Minnesota all our lives, and it took a lot out of us. My people aren't sure if we'll even like paradise, not sure that perfection is all it's cracked up to be." Aren't we weird people? Like, even if we were given what we wanted, we don't even like it. And so this is how God responds. Continuing in verse 1, chapter 11. When the Lord heard, his anger burned, and fire from the Lord blazed among them and consumed the outskirts of the camp. It said earlier when God's presence was with them, it was like fire. Well, I guess it wasn't just like fire. It was fire. And he burned them. It reminds me of probably the first, actually, Rolling Stones songs I ever heard. When you play with me, you're playing with fire. Well, that's exactly what happened. And it says he burned the outskirts. And they actually named that place, that town, Taberah, which literally means burning. It was a reminder of what God did in that moment. Remind them it's just like all the parent road trip threats that we make parents. It comes true. I will stop this car. I will turn it around, and I will set you on fire, right? Like it happened. It's a memorial to that fact. But guess what? They didn't learn. They didn't learn. Verse 4. The riffraff, which I love that translation of that term, the riffraff among them had a strong craving for other food. The Israelites wept again and said, "Who will feed us meat? We remember the free fish we ate in Egypt, along with the cucumbers and melons and leeks and onions and garlic, but now our appetite is gone and there's nothing to look at but this manna." See, as soon as they left Egypt, what God began to do for them was provide for their food something that's called manna, which literally means, what is it? Because every morning they get up and it was out there on the ground and God told them to gather it. And they kept saying, "What is this stuff? I don't know what it is." But it says they baked it into what was like pastries. And so every day they had a pastry. And I don't know about you, but I eat a pastry every day. It's not bad. But they began to complain about it. Said, "Can't we get better food? Can't we get a better menu?" And I want us to notice that it's not just about the menu. But what did they say? They said, "We wish it was like it was back in Egypt when we were in slavery. We liked it. It was more pleasurable back there than it is now free with our Lord." And it was a rejection of God's leadership as well as Moses' leadership. And it really talks to us about those unquenchable thirsts and appetites that James mentioned that happen in our life. Some appetites are really obvious. Food is an obvious appetite, and if it's left unchecked, can lead all the way to gluttony. Greed is an obvious appetite. Drunkenness is an obvious appetite. Lust is an obvious appetite. And when they're out of control, bad things happen. And we might call those things sins of our flesh. It comes from these fleshly desires and needs, when left unchecked and unmoderated, turn into bad things. But we also have to realize there's other appetites that aren't as easy to see. Appetites like pride and arrogance and self-righteousness. And we might call those sins of our soul. And both of those types of appetites, if we don't manage them well, can lead us into really bad places. But what I think is really interesting is that we in our culture, first of all, we tempt people to the edge of sins of the flesh, but as soon as someone steps into that, then they're criticized for those sins of the flesh, those moral failures. Like that is when we see people feel scandalized by what people have done. But Jesus, when he was on the earth, he was most scandalized by the sins of the soul. If you think about all of Jesus' interactions and even the stories he tells, almost always the three characters are Jesus himself or the Lord, a sinner of the flesh, and a sinner of the soul. It's when the religious leaders brought a woman caught in adultery and set him before Jesus. It's when we see the Pharisee and the tax collector both trying to be proven right in the sight of the Lord. And it's like this banquet we see in Luke chapter 7 where a guy named Simon, an important man in the community, invites Jesus over for dinner, but a prostitute sneaks in unseen by everybody until kind of get to the center of the story. And it's interesting, and maybe you want to read it this week, but I think if we don't read it in the first century context, we might miss some things. Because when Jesus comes into Simon's house, he invites him over. Simon doesn't greet Jesus with a kiss. And in their culture, that was how you greeted a guest into your home. You came and you kissed him on the cheek. But he doesn't offer that to Jesus. And it would just be like if you came over to my house and I didn't shake your hand and welcome you, I just kind of ignored you. Well, that's what Simon did to Jesus. He also didn't offer to wash Jesus' feet or have his servants wash Jesus' feet, which again was customary. And he didn't even offer to give Jesus something to wash his own feet, which would have been kind of like if I invite you over to dinner and say, hey, just so you know, at the end, you're doing all the dishes. But he didn't even do that. He didn't do anything. He disrespected Jesus. And again, we might miss that if we don't know the first century etiquette. But something was going on with Simon. And it's probably because he had an appetite for public opinion and power and his position. And whether it was because of fear of what people would say or whether he was trying to bait Jesus, for some reason, he totally was rude to Jesus when he came over to his house. But somehow, as people were watching Simon and Jesus and all this tension was going on, this woman of the night, this prostitute, slips in. And she's watching all this. And we don't know all of her story. People have kind of extrapolated some of it, tried to figure out some things. But we do know that she was a sinful woman. But for some reason, she thought Jesus had an answer for her. Maybe she'd heard him speak about grace and forgiveness. Maybe she'd seen him forgive others' sins. And she wanted to get close to that and see what that was like. But she probably also was watching this, and she knew that Simon was being disrespectful to this man who she thought, if she didn't think he was the Messiah, at least she thought he was a man who could help her. And so she goes over boldly, and she kneels down. She knows it's inappropriate to kiss him on the cheek, so she gets down, she kisses his feet. And in that moment of humiliation and emotion, she begins to weep. And as she weeps, her tears mingle with the dirt on Jesus' feet. And because she didn't have anything else, she did another completely culturally taboo thing. She took her hair down and wiped his feet with her hair. And then the last thing she did, she took this jar of perfume, which she probably had to use to help cover up some of the unpleasant things she did in her profession, and she poured that out on Jesus' feet and anointed him. And it was this statement to everybody in the room and to Jesus and to herself that she was broken, that she was undone, and that she was pouring her old life out because she wanted new life in wherever this man would lead her. She was looking for the hope and grace that she thought Jesus would offer, and she did it with great gratitude. Incredible story, incredible contrast of the different ways that people manage their appetites as well as how they responded to the presence of the Lord. And for us today, what appetites are you managing in your life? And how are you responding in those to the presence of the Lord? Is it with gratefulness or is it with grumbling? Well, back to our grumblers over in Numbers chapter 11. They call out for meat, and guess what? God answers them. Unbelievably, he gives them what they want. And in verse 18, he says, tell the people, consecrate yourselves in readiness for tomorrow, and you will eat meat because you wept in the Lord's hearing. Who will feed us meat? We are better off in Egypt. The Lord will give you meat, and you will eat. But you won't eat for 1 day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but for a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes nauseating to you because you have rejected the Lord who is among you and went before him. Why did we ever leave Egypt? That is a gross picture, isn't it? Like, that's extreme. I had a buddy of mine who he always referenced this as nostril sausage. And he's like, man, don't we want some of that nostril sausage, right? Like, he always said that whenever we were wanting things we shouldn't want, right? But it's this picture, this image of excess that they're asking for. And so God says, if you're asking for excess, I'm going to give you excess. And so he does this. Verse 31, a wind sent by the Lord came up and blew quail in from the sea. It dropped them all around the camp. They were flying 3 feet off the ground for about a day's journey in every direction. The people were up all that day and night and all the next day gathering the quail. The one who took the least gathered 60 bushels, and they spread them out all around the camp. Can you imagine 3 feet of birds, a day's walk in every direction you could look? That is a lot of quail. And then they gathered, it says the least of them gathered 60 bushels, which as people have tried to quantify that, they said that would be about 18 full black garbage bags full. Probably somewhere around 500 pounds per person of quail meat. So they wanted the nostril sausage. They wanted the excess. They were greedy and gluttonous, and they pulled that in. C.S. Lewis says this. He says, appetites grow through indulgence, not neglect. Gluttons think just as much about food as starving people. If we don't manage our appetites, they're going to lead us to places that are dangerous. Well, God's angered by this once again because they're not grateful and they're not giving themselves any moderation. And so verse 33 says, while the meat was still between their teeth before it was chewed, the Lord's anger burned against the people, and the Lord struck them with a severe plague. So they named that place Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people who had craved the meat. So that place, Kibroth Hattaavah, literally means the graves of craving. Doesn't that sound like a great tourist spot? Hey guys, where are you going to want to go today? Let's go visit the graves of craving. But it stood as this perpetual memorial for them of what had happened. And as a matter of fact, all of the book of Numbers and really most of the first 5 books of the Bible are a reminder for us that we don't really know what we want. You know, Numbers is the book that actually records the 40 days of wandering in the desert. And so as you read through that, if you're reading in the reading plan over the next few weeks, you're going to read that story of them wandering for 40 years. And the reason they wandered is because after they took that 3-day journey and they got to Kadesh Barnea, and they sent over some people to kind of scout out the promised land, they came back and said, oh no, it's going to be too hard. It's too many people. They're big. They're scary. There's no way we're winning this. We're not going to go over there and take over this land, guys. Not going to happen. And so God says, okay, well, I'll do it with your children then. And so you can just wander, and I'll just lead you around this little peninsula for 40 years until you all die, and then I'll take your children in. It doesn't have to be you. And literally the name for Numbers in the Hebrew is from the wilderness. And it's this connotation that this is a lesson to say, hey, remember your forefathers made some really bad decisions. Don't repeat those. And at the end of Numbers, where we get to is we get right back where we started. The next generation is sitting there at the border of the promised land, and they take another census, and they're getting ready to lead over. And then the book of Deuteronomy happens, the 5th book of the Bible, last of what they call the Pentateuch. And the book of Deuteronomy is Moses sitting down at that border and reminding them of everything God has done. And he starts out this way in Deuteronomy chapter 1. He says, we set out from Horeb, which is Mount Sinai, and went across all the great and terrible wilderness you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, just as the Lord our God had commanded us. And when we reached Kadesh Barnea, I said to you, you've reached the hill country of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. See, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up and take possession of it, as the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has told you. Don't be afraid or discouraged. But verse 26 says, but you were not willing to go up. You rebelled against the commands of the Lord your God. You grumbled in your tents and said, the Lord brought us out of the land of Egypt to hand us over to the Amorites in order to destroy us because he hates us. And they didn't go in. And Moses says, remember, don't repeat that when you head across here in a few days to the promised land. Over in the New Testament, Paul, in the first letter to the Corinthian church, repeats the same thing. In verse 10, it says this, "Now I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were under the cloud, that cloud of God's presence that led them day by day. And they all passed through the sea, that is the Red Sea, and they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And they all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ." And Paul points out to us that this wasn't just about physical provision, this was about spiritual provision, and that Christ was the one who was providing for them and leading them and redeeming them, even all the way back in the Exodus. Verse 5, "Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, since they were struck down in the wilderness. Now these things took place as examples for us, so that we will not desire evil things as they did. Don't become idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to party. Let us not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did, and in a single day 23,000 people died. Let us not test Christ, as some of them did, and were destroyed by snakes. And don't grumble, as some of them did, and they were killed by the destroyer. These things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our instruction, on whom the ends of the ages have come. So whoever thinks he stands must be careful not to fall. No temptation has come upon you except what is common to humanity, but God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation he will also provide the way out, so that you may be able to bear it. So then, my dear friends, flee from idolatry." And so speaking back from the New Testament all the way to what happened here in Numbers, Paul says, don't repeat those things. Don't desire what's evil. Don't be an idolater and put something else above God. Don't be sexually immoral. Don't put God to the test. Don't grumble in discontentment. And so this morning for us, are you discontent with some things? Are there things that you tend to be tempted to grumble about in your life right now? And if so, what are you going to do about it? You know, James told us that it's okay for us to come and ask God things. He says you should come and ask God things. You just got to find the right motives. And so maybe if we're supposed to ask God things, maybe what we're supposed to do is gather up all our discontentments. You know, we're going to gather up our small houses and our old cars and our thrift store wardrobes and our kinky hair and our 40-inch waists and our dead-end jobs, and we're going to gather all those things up in a pile, and we're going to come and we're going to say, God, you know what? This is what you gave me, and I don't think it's enough. You owe me. Does anybody feel comfortable with that? Are you guys okay with that? Is that uncomfortable? Think about doing that? You know why that is? It's because when we really are honest with ourselves, when we really come into the presence of the holy God who created us, gave us life, and we look at the little things that we are discontent with, and we look at what he's truly given us, we're going to realize that we have everything we need, and we actually have what we don't deserve. Because we realize when we come into the presence of God how far short we fall of his glory, and how much all of us have rebelled and sinned and been discontent and grumbled. And what we should see in that moment is this, is that our God, our Creator, went to such great lengths because he wanted a relationship with us. You know, the scripture tells us that while I was still a sinner, Christ died for me on the cross. And while I was running the other direction, while I was living for myself, trying to set up things my own way and rejecting God's way, he came and died for me to pay for my mistakes and my sin and my guilt. And he says, and I want to offer you as a free gift forgiveness for those things, and I want to cleanse those things from you, and I want to make you right if you'll just come and humble yourself and admit your need. What we really need is the grace of God. In Hebrews, the author puts it this way, speaking of Christ, he says, therefore, let us approach the throne of grace with boldness so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in times of need. James puts it this way, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. By his own choice, he gave us birth by the word of truth so that we would be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. The gifts that James is talking about is God's presence in our life, his forgiveness in our life, and his guidance and direction in our life. And he's given us those things freely. You know, I think when James wrote that, he probably had some of his brothers' interactions, Jesus' interactions and stories in his mind. Because there's this one story that Jesus shares that it's a fictional story, but it has those characters. It has the Lord in it. It has the sinner of the flesh. It has the sinner of the soul in it. And it's called the prodigal son. Maybe you've heard it. I don't know if Mick Jagger and Keith Richards have heard it, but I do know that they heard a song that a blues-playing preacher named Robert Wilkins wrote because they sang it and played it on one of their albums. And it says the story this way. It says, there was a poor boy who took his father's bread and started down the road, took all he had and started down the road, going out into this world where God only knows, and that'll be the way to get along. See, this one son wanted to go out and seek the pleasure of the world, and he literally said to his father, he's like, I wish you were dead, Dad. I wish you'd just give me your inheritance so I can go do what I want. And the father granted his wish. But you guys probably also know the story. You know, he spent all his money, and then when that was gone, he found himself pretty much in a gutter. And as he sat in that gutter one day, he came to his senses and he said, you know, even the servants in my dad's house are treated better than this. And so he humbled himself and he went back to his dad. But it says when he was a long way off, and the dad is the Lord in this story, he saw his son return and he ran to him and embraced him. He put a coat on him, put a ring on his finger and said, we're going to celebrate because this son of mine who was lost has been found. But you guys also probably remember that he had a brother who stayed to work the family farm and do all the right things. And when his brother hears all this, man, he is mad because he says, this isn't fair. I've stayed here. I've done the right things. I've been a good son. I've always made the right choices. I've always done whatever you've asked me. And this no good idiot brother of mine comes back and says he's sorry, and you're going to give him a calf. You've never even let me have one party with my friends. This isn't fair. And this is what the father says. He says, eldest son, kill the fatted calf. Call the family around. Kill that calf and call the family around. My son was lost, but now he's found, because that's the way for us to get along. The pathway out of discontentment, the pathway out of our grumbling and complaining, the pathway out of us feeling like we don't have what we need is celebration. Is us recognizing that the gifts that God has given us is exactly what we need. And so maybe that starts for ourselves, us being willing today to celebrate the things God's given us. God's given you life today. He's given you a choice today. He's given you an opportunity today. And most importantly, he's given you salvation today. He's given you the opportunity to have your sins forgiven and your relationship made right through him if you would just accept Christ as your Savior. He also provides for us. And maybe the most amazing thing that he does in some ways is that he promises through his Spirit to show up and give us counseling and direction in our life. How many of you need that? I need that. Just like that cloud came and God's presence led them, God wants to lead your life. And we need to celebrate that. We need to be thankful for that. And so today, as we get right here in a minute to sing a song of response, maybe you just need to come down symbolically to Jesus' feet and kneel at this altar and just thank him and celebrate the things that he's done in your life. But the other thing, and maybe the harder thing for us to do today, is the pathway out of discontentment not only is us celebrating what God's done in our life, but learning to celebrate what God's done in other people's lives. And particularly those that you tend to be jealous of. Particularly those who the grace of God in their life bothers you. Are there people in your life who you have a hard time celebrating their talents? Are there people in your life who you have a hard time celebrating their provision because it's different than the way God's provided for you? Are there people in your life that you have a hard time celebrating because you don't think they deserve grace? But we don't deserve grace. But he's offered it to us. We all need grace. And thank the Lord, he is in the grace business. And so today, will you celebrate the grace of the Lord in your life and the life of others so that we can follow him into that promised land? Would you guys stand with me?